everybody. Welcome to today's ACM SIGSOFT webinar. This webcast is part of ACM SIGSOFT's commitment to provide value to its current and future members. This webinar series features speakers from pretty much all over software engineering and often academics. It could be students, it could be people that we think have something interesting to say, often from industry. And we also pick select keynote speakers and distinguished paper authors. So today we have a talk called Software Developer Accountability in the AI Era. Let me just go double check that our speakers are in this room, that our panelists are here. Oh, I see, hang on. They're still in. Let me move them here. All right, so we have speaker Neil Ernst, we have Adam Alami, and my co-moderator Sridhar Chimalakanda. Today's talk is going to be from Neil and Adam. So they're going to be talking about the software developer accountability in the AI era. And their abstract is being accountable to one's teammates has positive effects on teamwork and efficiency. In this webinar, Neil will introduce a series of studies they have conducted on the nature of accountability in software teams. They'll introduce concepts of institutional and grassroots accountability and expand on how intrinsic drivers of accountability, like pride in one's code quality, impact team dynamics. He'll conclude by examining how the introduction of AI tools and code review influence these feelings of accountability. Their findings imply that the introduction of AI into software engineering must preserve the social integrity and collective accountability mechanisms. Now, if you have questions, you can either type them into the chat or you can click on the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar, and we will read them out loud for Neil and Adam to answer. If you have a really, really urgent question, probably do it under the Zoom chat, and I'll interrupt Neil if it's super important. Otherwise, we'll go until about 45 minutes after the hour, and then we'll start taking questions for everybody. And then we'll go until the end of the hour and get you all out of here. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please send a message on the Zoom chat to Sridhar and I, and we will make sure to get one of those to you within the next couple days. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Neil and to start the talk.
Great, thanks, Andy. I assume you can hear me and see the slides.
Yep, I think it looks good.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for setting this up, and appreciate the opportunity to give the webinar, coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples here in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And it's great to see everybody from around the world joining the webinar. It's really exciting. Thanks to Sridhar and Andy, of course, for giving us the opportunity to do this. So we're going to talk today about software developer accountability and what accountability means, and then some of the findings we've come across with respect to that in the Gen AI era of software development. So this is based on a couple of different papers that we can provide references for after the fact. Some papers in ACM's flagship software engineering journal, TOSM, and then 2 papers in Conference on Human Aspects of Software Engineering. By the way, I'm the PC chair for the 2026 version, so if you have papers on human aspects, then please do send those to the Chase 2026 program committee. Shameless plug there. So I'm an associate professor in the University of Victoria in the computer science department, and I've done some work in the past in Pittsburgh with the Software Engineering Institute looking at large-scale software systems. My colleague Adam, who's also online, is the more knowledgeable of the two of us and is an associate professor in the University of Southern Denmark with a lot of industry experience. So today we'll go over sort of the nature of accountability and what that looks like, what forms that takes in the software field, and then we'll look at some specific aspects of that with respect to code review, and then, of course, nowadays Gen AI is a big player in code review, and so we'll talk a bit about what we found there from our qualitative studies. The overall research agenda that I think Adam and I share that other people in the human aspects community share, people like Andy, for example, is a lot of what we look at is the blue software engineering oval there, which is artifacts like tests and formal verification and programming language questions. But surrounding that are all of these sort of rich socio-technical aspects. So what organizational context are you operating in, right? Maybe it's a regulated industry. What's the team and company culture? What are your individual characteristics? What values do you bring? All of those things, influence the practices, the artifacts that we create as part of software engineering. And so our higher level research agenda is really about understanding how all of these things influence and are influenced by the software engineering artifacts. And of course, nowadays, a big piece of this is tools like Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, Copilot, and so on that are having influences on all of these external bubbles, right? So the culture, the team, the individual capabilities, the organizational context have all been, pretty radically reshaped, I think, with respect to the introduction of AI tools. Adam and I operate in this community of empirical software engineering, and maybe your question would be, well, what kind of research would you do if that's not empirical? So, you might look at this from a theoretical lens, for example. Programming languages is a classic example here, where you try to establish, concepts and proofs without needing to do any empirical work. We have sort of three main groupings of research strategies that we take. The ones that I'm going to talk about today are primarily qualitative, which are really well suited to understanding human dynamics and team dynamics, things that are not as explicitly recorded. And of course, there's quantitative approaches that look at things like what pull requests were committed to this particular repository, what types of tests are being run. We have been entering a new era of empirical software engineering, given all of the rich sources of data, for example, all the data that's available from GitHub that you can go and mine and look at and try to make sense of software problems with. So accountability. Accountability is about, I think we all have experienced this in our life. We can look at it from, I think, two perspectives. One is sort of these formal mechanisms to ensure accountability. So you might say, well, I'm accountable to my employer because they hold responsibility for giving me a bonus at the end of the year if I do the work that I'm, in a good way. If I don't do it, then I could be punished by being fired or something. So there's this sense of accountability from an organizational and explicit way, right? There's some, certain consequences to not doing what you are responsible for. Then, of course, there's sort of grassroots or individual accountability, right? If your partner is expecting you to come home so that you can make dinner before your children have to go to the sports practice, then, probably you're not going to lose your bonus if you don't do that. I don't know. Depends on how your household's set up, I suppose, but you're more accountable in sort of informal way, right? You'll feel awkward or embarrassed, hopefully, that you didn't show up on time to make the dinner for your children. So the definition we're using in our work is this one on the screen. So being held responsible for your actions and decisions, including this obligation to explain them to others. And I think you can see where this would enter into the software engineering practices, right? So if I do work in my organization, then I might feel a sense of accountability to my coworkers, to my employer, to myself, and so on. That's what we're looking at here. Accountability is a really important mechanism, right? So Thomas Paine, famous philosopher, has this quote about, if you're not accountable, then you shouldn't be trusted by anyone, right? Because lack of accountability means you can do whatever you would like. So accountability is a really important driver of polite behavior, of sort of social norms and social expectations that we're trying to use to maintain stability in our social systems, right? Without accountability, for example, transparency in how decisions are made by government, then it becomes difficult to trust that decisions are being made in a reasonable way. The originations for accountability in the software sense came from Adam's work in looking at how people do agile software development. So in the past, if people are old enough to remember this, before the agile era, before Scrum, XP, and so on, we had very formal accountability mechanisms. So something like the personal software process or the team software process that the Software Engineering Institute had, very much about you need to record what you're doing. You need to show me the numbers for the things that you're delivering. And Scrum came along and said, we don't need all of this huge amount of process. What we could do is just trust that my coworker is going to do the work and then that I have some insight into why they're doing that. So Adam's work found that there's this need for transparency when you adopt an agile methodology because you're not going to ask for a lot of explicit documentation, but that then drives this sense of accountability for what you're doing and then influences your expectations for the quality of the software, right? So if you're accountable, then there's a link there between accountability and improving the software quality. So we'll focus on this accountability piece in the three research papers and research work that Adam and I have been engaging in. So let me talk a little bit about how we first started looking at this construct of accountability. The first questions that we were looking at in 2023, I suppose, was what are the mechanisms organizations themselves implement? So those are those sort of formal mechanisms, and what are the outcomes they're trying to control? So you could see a mechanism like bonuses or salary or promotion increases as one of these formal mechanisms, right? If you do stack ranking or whatever, individual goals and objectives meetings with your manager, those are formal accountability mechanisms. And then, building on that Scrum Works, Adam was asking, well, what are the key factors and practices that contribute to individual accountability, right? Beyond whatever the organization is telling you need to do. So as a result of that initial interview study, we came up with the following sort of theoretical conceptual map. So I call these the building blocks of accountability. On the top left, you see the influencers of accountability. So that might be things like how big is your team? On the bottom left, you see the control mechanisms we identified. So for example, you might have performance evaluations, which I've been talking about. You might have testing to see if your team is doing the right, is developing the right software. On the bottom right, they're the drivers of accountability. So these are the sort of motivations for why you're accountable. Some of them are, things like punishment, I might get fired, but others are these intrinsic drivers, we'll call them. So bottom right there, those are things like the personal standards. So I think one thing that was surprising for me in looking at these interviews is just, I guess maybe it's not surprising in hindsight, but just how important it was for people to just write good code for its own sake. It wasn't that they really felt that they needed to help the company's bottom line. It was because they really took pride in the work that they did. And it was important to them to do that work in a high quality and high standard way. So personal standards and your professional reputation were important intrinsic drivers of accountability. And of course, all of these things, you can see in the middle there, so this collective accountability, institutional accountability, and self-accountability affect the software quality. Like how good is the software we're delivering? Are we meeting deadlines? Right? Our sense of accountability is going to have a big influence on those things. If you're in a culture where no one's valuing your contribution, or maybe you're remote and you're not being included in the team, then your sense of accountability is diminished, and consequently the quality of the software is diminished as well. So out of that sort of broad notion of what accountability looks like, because we didn't really have a good sense for what that looks like from this theory, we came up with more detailed questions we could look at, in particular for the control mechanism of code review. So you see that on the bottom left there. Code review is one of these team control mechanisms that's reinforcing the sense of collective accountability. So we studied that. And our questions there were, what are these sort of intrinsic drivers that influence people's sense of accountability for the quality of their code? And how does the introduction of this, AI assistance, influence or change their idea of accountability, right? So if you were working pre-2022, you had autocomplete, but not a lot of LLM assistance. Now you have, whether you want to or not, GitHub tells you, gives you a code review on your pull request and will give you some evaluation. So what does that do to our sense of accountability? So for people who are not familiar with this mechanism, I'm guessing most of you are, the code review models are now widely adopted in trunk-based development. So you branch some of the code base, you make some changes, and then you try to merge that back into the trunk. And almost always in organizations, this is something that requires a second or third or fourth party to review it before they just merge it in there, right? So you've got your proposed change, and then some presumably senior colleague or expert in that area goes by and takes a look at what code you created. It's a highly social process, so there's a lot of technical questions about, I don't know how you implemented this particular thing with an array or a list or whatever, but then also a lot of social dimensions because innately you're talking to another human being, well, most of the time. And so you have some sort of interaction on a personal level with those people. So maybe you're talking to your boss, you're going to have a different interaction than if you're talking to a colleague or a coworker. So those are two important mechanisms there. And I think there's also this sense of formal and informal accountability. So you might formally be, judged on how often your merge requests get accepted. You might be informally accountable to your team to not waste their time by, producing merge requests that are really difficult to review or something like that. So what did we do? We looked at 16 different people that we recruited from Prolific, which is a sort of platform for finding participants. And we talked to those software engineers for 45 minutes to an hour about these kinds of accountability questions, what their sense of it was. Then the second thing we did, which is I think fairly novel, was looking at 4 focus groups. So we got 5 to 6 participants to sort of participate in a mock code review process, with us as the researchers, sort of shepherding them along. Because what we wanted to see was, obviously things will be different if I ask you to reflect on, your experiences with code review. You're subject to potential, respondent bias. You might tell me what I want to hear. You might not remember things correctly. So if we use this focus group approach, we're trying to simulate as much as possible how this code review process works in reality. So the most realistic way to do this would be to go to a company, Microsoft, for example, and watch the code review process as an independent observer. But absent that level of access, we look for more generalizability, and we can do this with these recruited focus groups. The downside, of course, is it's a little bit more artificial, right? Because we're not looking at their day-to-day workings, their own particular organizational culture. So we start out with these individual interviews in phase 1. That comes up with some claims that people have about how they understand the code review process, as they've been experiencing it. And then we look at these 4 focus groups. And what we're going to do there is we're going to take different scenarios to try and see what the dimensions of accountability might look like. So we get that social interaction piece. In focus group 1, for example, we looked at role hierarchy. So we tried to assign people roles based on their seniority and authority. So how much did you know about the code, to try and simulate where a junior developer was reviewing a senior developer's code, right? Where you might have some hesitation around saying everything based on your desire not to offend the senior reviewer, for example. Then other focus groups were things like, is this a public review? Is this a review of a different team? How complex is the code? So we varied all of those things to try and get a rich understanding of all of the information and all of the concepts people were looking at. The second thing we looked at was introducing a large language model response to this. So in this scenario, we had the focus groups, but then we added as a team member ChatGPT-4 as a next reviewer to give some more feedback on the code. And then we asked people, how they responded to that and how they understood that. So what we came up with was this sense of what grassroots accountability looks like. So this is sort of this idea of reciprocity to your peers, I think outside of these formal mechanisms. So outside of your desire to be promoted or your desire to not be fired or whatever, those sort of explicit mechanisms, there's a real sense of grassroots accountability. I need to know that my colleagues feel that I'm doing a good job because that's important to me. I have my internal intrinsic drivers, my personal standards, but I also have this collective accountability where I'm looking for, to try and help satisfy the expectations my peers have for the work I'm doing, right? I think you could analogize this to, I want to be able to show up at the water cooler or the coffee machine the next day and be able to look people in the eye because they thought that the code I wrote was good quality, right? Like it got the job done and they have new respect for me. And importantly here is this idea of psychological safety. So this is a concept that means uh, I shouldn't feel like if I do make a mistake that people are going to punish me or I'm going to be held accountable for that mistake in an unfair or unrealistic mechanism. So this was an important promoter of a sense of collective accountability. So what we discovered was that people will engage in these control mechanisms, but one of the things they have to do is start to regulate how they're responding to their colleagues' reviews. So, for example, once you put yourself out there, so to speak, if you contribute your code as a merge request and now you've requested review from a colleague, you're in a vulnerable position because the colleague could come back, and I think, the Linux kernel is a famous example of this, and, just be very blunt and tell you that you're an idiot and that this was terrible code and they don't know why you're working at the company, right? So there's this risk that those people are going to, if you don't have that psychological safety, if you don't have that in place, then those, you're very vulnerable at that time. And so what we saw was people sort of regulating their own need for personal standards to sort of say, look, I know I'm going to get critiqued because nothing's perfect. If I'm in a good company culture, then I'm not too worried about that because I know they're going to critique the code I wrote and not critique me as an individual. So individual accountability came from, these four aspects that drove in a sense for code quality. And I'll go into these in a bit more detail. So your sense for personal standards, what you like to see in the work you do, your pride in the work you do, your need for integrity and professionalism, and then finally your reputation in the company. And of course, some of these are tied into formal mechanisms. Presumably, if your reputation is increased, then management will notice that and you'll get the bonus or the promotion or what have you. So this is maybe not something that's explicitly just about, oh, I'm going to do this because I like what I'm doing. So pride in code quality, we see things like I write code and I'm happy because I wrote good code, and that's something that I'm sort of intrinsically motivated by, and it doesn't matter who's reviewing my code because it's important just to me that it's good. Then there's idea of personal standards. So these are quotes from participants, by the way. So that's what P8 and P13 and so on refer to. And I want to build the best quality possible so that it's beyond expectation, and I don't want to have a sense that my standards are lower than everybody else's. And then professional integrity. So this is, I think, tied in to ethics. We didn't look at that, but this idea that I should be writing code, and I need to have a sense for this isn't the right way to do that. I shouldn't be doing this because that's not an integral way to do that. Finally, maintaining your reputation, that idea that I want to have my image as a professional software developer. I want to be respected by the other members of my team. So the other finding we came up with was this idea that there's this transition from a sense of individual accountability to one of collective accountability. So I'm going to, so the previous slide is looking at these senses of what makes you feel like a sense of individual accountability. Then there's this transition as you work in these teams with different code reviewers to a sense of collective accountability. You as a team, that are working on this particular feature, for example, have a responsibility to the other people on your team to do a good job. And so what we understand is that this is a transition from sort of self-regulation to social validation. So we're going to be less concerned about our pride in the quality of the code. We're going to be cautious about our professional integrity. As I said, you're going to get reviewed by other people, so you don't want to be too prideful and have people, hurt your feelings because they said your code wasn't great. So people were anticipating this and were less concerned about this in the review process and feedback process. But once once this was, recognized, then, came along with a sense of, maintaining reputation and personal standards so that you would get validation from the other people on your team. So we call this down regulating because, it's not so much about me, it's about holding each other accountable for the code quality. From a professional integrity point of view, this is sort of a reorientation. So, we don't take things personally. This is, the way to act on, the way to maintain your integrity is to act on the feedback, right? Someone said something about the code, so you're going to respond to that. And then social validation, this idea that, like, I'm going to get a sense of, in this case, joy when teammates say, hey, this was, you did a nice job on this merge request. So what that leads to is this sort of cycle of accountability. So you start out at the top left with the sense of individual accountability. As you submit your merge request for code review, you regulate your own personal sense of pride and concern about your code, looking for social validation. Then as people review your code, you self-regulate, so you don't take things too personally, or at least the people in the study, and then you look for social validation. So is my personal standard going to be maintained? And then finally, as a team, you develop this sense of collective accountability. So you will, review each other's code and, help each other get to a high level of code quality. So this idea of reciprocity with the other people in your team. So then the next question we were looking at is, okay, well, if that's the way that a team of humans is working, what happens when we introduce something like ChatGPT into the process, where ChatGPT is now another team member that's adding reviews to your particular set of code, to your code review, request, merge request, and so on. What we found is it's a very disruptive process, and really, uproots and influences the way in which this transition to collective accountability happens. So we no longer have this reciprocity of accountability. So, in a human setting, I feel obligated to my teammate to do a good job. They feel a reciprocal sense of accountability to me to do a good job. That helps us to develop a collective accountability. With an AI, there's no such reciprocity. I don't really feel like I'm accountable to ChatGPT to do a good job with code because it's not a human, and it's not the same mechanism. Then presumably there's no peer recognition. Like, it's not, I mean, of course, ChatGPT will tell you that, that's a great idea or whatever they've trained it to do. That's not really the same as, a human colleague saying, hey, that was a really nice merge request. Maybe this will change 10 years from now. I'm not sure. And then we also don't get the same sense of personal satisfaction. So what we found is that, it disrupts this sense of collective accountability. So here's some quotes to give an example of this, right? I'm not accountable to it. It's just a tool. My accountability for code quality can't be shared the way I did with, and in this case, with participant 27, right? It doesn't feel anywhere close to the same thing. There's no social validation because, like, if it says you did a good job, I think people understand that that's not really, that's just a sort of thing that's been trained into the model. And it basically always tells you that you're really good at what you're doing, even when maybe you're not. So, in this particular quote, I get half of the amount of joy from the AI saying I did a good job than I do from human feedback. It's like having a compiler, saying that, hey, great, your code compiled. Okay, fine, like that. But that's what it's supposed to do, right? It's not something that gives me a lot of joy. And then finally, there was some worries about the quality and trust that people had in the LLMs, right? So the idea is that colleagues are experts and understand, not just the syntax of Python or whatever it is that you're looking at, but actually the context of the local, company culture and product that you're working on, right? Maybe it's a very specific regulated industry, and the AI just doesn't, you can't trust it to know all of the details about the product you're working on. Then finally, this idea of LLM limitations, right? It doesn't have a goal in mind. It doesn't really know why we're doing this, and it doesn't really know all of the rest of the code base. Of course, I should caveat this by saying that this was a study done in 2020, late 2024, and it's possible some of these things will change. Although, in my experience over the last year and a half, I don't think any of these things have really gone away. And if anything, we've seen more and more examples where LLMs are really not doing a great job. So to summarize this aspect of the work, we started out by looking at what kinds of accountability exist in code review teams. We found there's, individual and collective accountability. So individual was about your personal standards and your reputation, and collective accountability was more about things like, what did my peers think about this? And, do I get social validation? Do people think I'm doing a good job? When we introduced the LLM as a code reviewer, we noticed that this was a disruptive thing. There was lack of reciprocity. There was worries about the limitations of the LLMs. So I'd say we have now a much richer sense of what leads to accountability in software teams, and in particular in the code review setting. And I'll follow up with a few recommendations after the next portion of the talk. Obviously Gen AI has been a big influence on how we do software development. So our next study, we turn to look at this in more detail. What is it that Gen AI code review does to a sense of accountability? So again, thinking back to this picture here, we're looking at all of the external factors that might influence the software engineering artifacts. So these sort of cultural, social, technical aspects. And back to the research agenda, right? This idea of control mechanisms and software quality and how this plays a role, in particular, looking at this idea of code review. And the research question here is, well, what do you do when this becomes more of a collaborator, right? We know it's disruptive on our sense of collective accountability, but what happens when AI becomes whether you like it or not, an integral part of your software engineering team, right? Maybe it's imposed on you from management or something. This type of Clippy, for those of you that remember Clippy, interrupting you and saying, hey, I see you're trying to do some AI stuff. Let me help you. So here again, we had looked at people on, I think it was Upwork, looking for interview participants, and we had them submit code that they authored. And we then had other interviewees, human interviewees, review that code submission. We also, so we shared those reviews. And then we also had ChatGPT-4 review the code. So, to participate in this study, you submitted some code that you wrote with the caveat that it probably is something you're comfortable sharing with 19 random people. And then you also had ChatGPT-4 review your code. In this study, we didn't do anything deceptive, so they knew that there was an LLM that was reviewing the code. An interesting study might be to say, hey, which review is better, human or LLM? We didn't do that in this study, though. We then asked them to share their thoughts and reactions and so on from the human participants, and then compare those to the reviews that they got from the LLM, right? So compare these two approaches. What is the difference, if any, between these things? So we ask questions like this, what do you feel when you get feedback from your peers? Would you respond and react the same way to feedback from LLMs as you did to the human feedback? We analyzed this as we did the previous study in a sort of thematic analysis way that you can find in the reference in the bottom right corner there, pretty standard approach in the community. And, here's some of the findings we came up with. So I like to discuss to make it direct overall. I don't want to say too much. I want to stay in the context. Again, so they're looking at 3 code reviews from their human peers and 1 from the LLM, and we asked them to look, which one do you like best, or which one, whatever, aspects they're interested in. But, the LLM one in the bottom quote here was their favorite. The human beings are impatient. They didn't get into enough detail. And this particular person really liked the detail the LLM did. And of course, this is something LLMs were super good at doing. They're great at finding all of the details about your code and trying to understand, and of course, unlike a human, they have sort of infinite amount of time or as much money as you want to spend. They'll spend churning away on your code, and so they can develop a very sophisticated and detailed code review. So this person really liked that amount of detail, right? So it was a good thing for them. This resulted in the following sort of set of findings. So what we see is that the reviewer context was influencing the level of engagement. So maybe it's a minor merge request. It's not super important. You're not going to spend a lot of time engaging with it. When it comes to the sense for, what makes it important for humans, it could be either seniority, like I'm going to pay attention because this is my team lead, or this is someone senior in the organization that I should probably pay attention to. And familiarity, I'm going to pay attention to this because I know person X is a, close friend or colleague of mine, and I trust what they have to say. When it came to the LLM review, the concerns there sort of echo the ones that we saw in the previous study. This idea that we need to be able to trust the LLM and that it knows what it's doing, that it's not making up things about, the way in which this set of Python code should be structured and the limitations that it comes with. And then the feedback sort of mechanisms also influence the level of engagement. So let's talk a bit about the types of engagement people had in the code review. So there's cognitive engagement, so the mental resources that you allocate as a human to process the feedback. When it comes to human, the constructive feedback had a low cognitive load. So if someone says something constructive and helpful, there wasn't a lot of cognitive demand there. But often with the LLMs, there's just, at least in the sort of setup that we came up with, there's just way too much detail. And you can, of course, tailor this to some extent, but still a lot of cognitive load just processing, so much critique of your particular code review, which you didn't get usually from the humans. Now, some people, that's great, but for everyone, this would imply a lot of cognitive demand. From an emotional engagement point of view, so, what does this make you feel? The sort of peer review from humans, if it was constructive, you felt good. If it was unconstructive or hostile, then you felt, negative emotions and the need to sort of self-regulate. From the LLM, because it's a very consistent delivery and tone, people had less emotional taxation. It's a machine. It's just giving me the facts. There's no sort of implicit critique of me as a person. There's less load on me emotionally. I'm not going to need to worry about this too much. Another level of engagement with the review was your behavior. So what did you do as a result of the review? If this was a negative emotion, you were less likely to engage in a lengthy way. Positive emotions, then you're more willing to go and do something about the comments that someone gave you, right? So there's an argument for structuring your code reviews in a constructive way. With the LLM, there's some willingness to engage and do something with it. But again, this comes back to the trust thing. So it tells me to do X, Y, and Z. But maybe I don't know if it's actually correct about having to do Y. So there's some more cognitive load there as well with, do I actually think it knows what it's talking about? Finally, from a sense-making engagement point of view, so this sense-making is this idea of like, how do I reconcile what I'm being told with the things that I already internally know about how to do this and how to pursue adoption? We found that this was actually pretty similar in both types of reviews. So if a human said, I think you should actually structure your class this way, then, and the LLM said something similar, there was a very similar sense-making process from the human point of view, right? I have to go and say, okay, well, why did they say to do that? Because I always did it this way. So I need to come up with a similar mechanism in both respects to try and understand how to reconcile these sort of conflicting worldviews. In all of our studies, there's a couple of limitations that we should, of course, talk about. So the ChatGPT tool that we used, ChatGPT 4, was as of 2024, I believe. And so there's less, there's more, I guess, customization. We know more now about context engineering and prompt engineering. So maybe we can tune some of these things. So for example, we can tune the AI to give us more constructive feedback or to give us less detail. And so that's something we didn't test, but would be important to test. I still think that the problems with things like trust in the LLM have not changed all that much since we did the study. The code that we were looking at was limited because, you're probably not going to share your actual well, you probably shouldn't be sharing your actual company code in an interview study like this. So we weren't able to get access to that. And the code reviews were anonymous. So like I said, you got reviewed by 3 people, but we didn't share their names and identities just to preserve anonymity in the study. And that's not realistic, right? In a real code review, well, it's somewhat realistic in some environments, but in a true corporate environment, you probably know the teammates that are reviewing your code. Unlike most real teams, we were anonymous. And I think someone asked, but the AI, they did know that this was ChatGPT that was reviewing their code. So it wasn't like we said, here's 4 reviews. What do you think? They knew that one of them was an AI tool. Okay, so we've done these 3 studies. The first one looking at what exactly is accountability in software engineering. The second one looking at, well, how do people develop this sense of accountability with respect to code review? And the third study looking at what is the difference between the review you get from a human and the review you get from an LLM or an AI tool. So what are some of the takeaways and predictions that are happening here? So I think, clearly there's a big change in the equation with introduction of AI tools. So these reviews definitely reduce the emotional strain and increase cognitive effort. And I know Andy, for example, Andy Bagel, the host of the webinar, has done a lot of work on how this might help if you're not good at communicating things in a constructive way, which some people are not. For example, if you're on the autism spectrum, for example, an LLM could be super useful for helping you phrase things in a more constructive way to decrease the cognitive load on the people that you're working with. So the recommendation there is, and I would have said this before the study, and I say it even more now, that it's even more critical to foster a sense of emotional intelligence in the people that we're hiring. Less emphasis on the technical skills, perhaps, and more on like, how do I communicate with my teammates? And maybe how do I use LLMs to help me develop this or to work on this? The humans still bring a lot of depth, and I think would be it's sort of irreplaceable here, right? So there's a sense of relational capital, a sense of mentorship, contextual knowledge that we're losing when we just hand it over to an LLM. At least the LLMs is currently structured. And personally, I think they're not going to be able to replace things like mentorship and relational capital for sure, and probably not even contextual knowledge. Some of the research I've done in other studies looks at domain knowledge. The LLMs really are still quite poor at understanding your contextual nuances. So again, training and giving constructive feedback, training in how to provide this relational capital and mentorship. There's still a lot of tension here, and probably you all are very familiar with this, right? Engineers are divided. Some people really like the concise and actionable feedback. They just want the facts, but other people really value the human insights and discussion that they get from their colleagues. So personalizing the AI feedback in order to help tailor this for whoever is on your team and what their particular style of feedback is, right? So if I get a review from GitHub, the bot on GitHub and a pull request, it might say something different based on who is in this particular pull request. So is this disrupting or enhancing software development? I think the answer is that it's doing both, right? We found accountability is critical for individual motivation and accomplishment. AI tools are disrupting the sense of collective accountability because teams aren't trusting them and you don't get that sense of mentorship or whatever. And the recommendation here is to really be careful in your practices at a management level of delineating the scope for the AI feedback, right? It's not just about can we deliver the facts correctly can we correctly analyze the technical details of the code review? There's this whole other very rich human aspect, socio-technical aspect to code review and software development that I think there's a risk that we are ignoring when we introduce these AI tools, willy-nilly, right? If we just say everyone is now going to just have code review by AI, we're not going to do any human code review, you're going to lose a lot of this sort of relational capital and mentorship and sort of sense of belonging and accountability for the software that your team is delivering. That's the conclusion of my talking portion of the webinar. I linked to the preprint for our latest paper and the replication package. And of course, you can ask questions now, or you can email Adam and myself with questions at any time. And yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neil, very much for your great talk. This is super cool stuff. I loved it. I was like, whoa. One of my students is here in the webinar watching, and he's like texting me on Discord. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm working on that theory, and that's
Cool.
good stuff going on here, which is fantastic." Let me unpin you so everyone can start, or unspotlight you so everyone can start seeing you. Room spotlight. There we go. That's everybody. Great. So we have time for 13 minutes for questions from everybody in the audience. We have had a whole bunch of them show up on the Q&A tab, and I will read out some of those questions. And also Adam has been answering a few of them that are better answered in text. So Philippe Vincent asks, were you studying mostly USA-centered products or products from other countries?
So the way we recruit people is international. I can't confirm exactly. Adam would know the answer to that best, but it was pretty broad. So it wasn't well, neither of us are in the US, so it definitely wasn't just Americans. But I think the sort of undercurrent to that question is, this cultural question, which I think is something that I know some other people in the community have looked at, but I think is hugely important. So, for example, your sense of accountability might be very different in an Indian context from a Canadian context, for example. And again, culture is a much richer and more nuanced thing than I'm making it out to be here. But maybe you have a sense for, and I can't remember who did this study on Bangladeshi developers, whereas like it's really important to keep the boss happy. Whereas in Canada, at least, I mean, I kind of care about that, but I also kind of don't worry too much about that. It's a much more informal relationship. So the answer is yes, we study people outside of the US context. And the second answer is there's a lot more stuff to look at with respect to different company cultures and corporate cultures and national cultures.
Great, thank you. Palaginati has a question. Is there similar research about software engineering accountability and their feelings about reviewing changes produced by LLM agents, particularly for large changes versus small changes? Do you think that matters?
I don't think so. We're sort of the people who are working on accountability. Adam would know better, but the literature that we were basing this on comes out of social psychology and sociology in places like business settings. So for sure, they have looked at accountability in business context. So maybe that kind of large change comes. For things like, hey, should we, re-engineer the product from scratch, or should we continue to add things on? Then I don't think anyone's looked at that, but that would be a really interesting thing to examine.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd like to add something
Go ahead.
regarding the parallels between software engineering practices or software engineering culture and other practices outside software engineering, like in medicine or in audit, etc. There are parallels, especially the institutionalized mechanism of enforcing accountability, like salary, promotion, etc. There are parallels, but at the level of the teams, we didn't see parallels with other practices other than nonprofit and volunteering teams. The intrinsic drivers and the collective or the grassroots accountabilities, we couldn't see parallels other than nonprofit culture or the culture of volunteering. When it comes to change and the magnitude of change, I think the participant has a good point. The snippet or the code we use, where what would you call is not in a professional level, they are not large. Yeah, so we didn't go up beyond 50 lines of code to keep it simple and to focus on the dynamic rather than the complexity of the code. But if we introduce complexity, we may see other mechanisms of accountability come into play. Yes, that's a good point.
All right, thanks, Adam. All right, we're going to go back to the Q&A for a few more questions. Is LLM-based code review better than positive feedback from developers? Does LLM-assisted code review demotivate developers since there's no human interaction there?
Yeah, I think the what we found was it. Oh, sorry. I mean, I hate to say that it depends because that's sort of the standard answer to all software engineering questions. But I think, you know, for some people who are very detail oriented or in a particular context of the code review, for example, you want to find, does this have security holes? Yes or no? LLM is doing a great job there, subject to your trust in its ability to actually correctly do the, you know, give the answer. But I think, and again, I would, defer to Andy on this question. I think there's a risk that if you are solely engaged on this technical frontier, you're going to miss out on developing some of the relational capital. If your interest is in getting promoted, for example, the promotion is probably not, except in maybe very rare cases where you're a genius coder, it's almost certainly not just your technical contributions. So there's a risk, I think, of just interacting with LLMs and not interacting with your other teams. And I know people like my colleague, Margaret Ann Story, have been looking at this in sort of remote working contexts where, people aren't talking on Slack to humans as much anymore because they just talk to LLMs and they get feedback from that. And so there's some concern. I think we don't really know exactly what's happening here, but there's some concern that leads to a much poorer sort of social and cultural context in your company.
One aspect of that I do want to comment on that I find really interesting is that if the use of LLM is causing behavior change, I mean, that's a really powerful kind of tool out there. It's really hard to make people change what they do and change their habits. I remember
Right.
when I first was able to get my email on my phone and respond to it, I stopped using my laptop computer. Like it never got open because I could just do everything on the phone. And I didn't cause that to happen. It was actually probably a positive for me in that it was probably dysfunctional of me to keep opening a laptop. But it's rare to find these kind of disruptive changes that really change behavior. And hopefully they're being designed for good effects on people's personalities and relations instead of bad ones.
Hopefully.
We've got a couple more questions. Based on your experience in studying accountability, what attitude towards accountability might be beneficial to develop in novice software developers?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. You want to, I think and I don't know the answer to this, Adam, maybe you do, but this idea of individual accountability, like, are you someone who, when you get given an assignment in undergrad, when you're a junior or whatever student, do you care about the quality of the work independent of the grade you might be getting? I mean, of course, everybody's somewhat on a spectrum here, but and can we develop that sense for pride in the work that you're doing? And I think that's an important question to look at. It's not one that we directly looked at, but maybe Adam, you know more on this.
Yeah, what we observe and that we saw in social sciences, this is not something you could teach. This is something you internalize. This is something you see your mother, you see your father, you see your mentor is doing. And what's in social sciences, because they are ahead of us in this type of work, they saw mentorship as a mechanisms of teaching these type of values, because accountability is a value. So once you see your mentor is accountable, he or she has pride in the code they write, they have personal standard, then the chances that you may pick that value is high. But something that you put in a classroom and you tell your student, you need to be accountable for the code of quality, I highly likely would expect all my students will turn onto social media and stop listening to me. So it is a value that we need to transmit through mentorship, through teamwork, etc. It is difficult to teach as a concept.
Thank you, Adam. All right. Let's go for a few more questions. We have 4 minutes left. One aspect towards code review is that LLMs can review changes in significantly shorter amounts of time. I remember having to wait a couple of days before my manager would review my code. How much does the convenience impact the value?
Yeah, so we didn't look at that because we just gathered the reviews and then sent them out sort of as one. So it looked like there was no time delay. But I do know that this is a significant blocker for a lot of companies. So it's not an aspect we've looked at, but I think it's an important one. Other ones that we would want to look at are how much money are you having to pay for the LLM to do this job? You know, there's of course climate considerations, like how much carbon dioxide are you burning to answer this question? We didn't really look at those external factors, but I think I agree that that's a really important question to ask if you get the feedback right away versus, you know, a day or two.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right. Edward Burns says, let's assume that the code review outcomes in terms of improving or not reducing the quality of the code is quantifiably better. Could that help build trust or even cause people to trust human reviewers less? So I think if the LLM makes your code better, quantifiably better, would that just mean that we build trust with the LLM and therefore you don't need to have human reviewers, or you would not trust what they're going to tell you?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Adam.
I can answer that. This is what we're looking at now. We observed that other factor could calibrate the trust. One of the factor is the LLM output. We found that it's demanding on the cognitive demand of the developers. Many of them rejected it. So we start experimented with that, aligning the output of the AI tools with the preferences of the software engineer to see whether the trust will improve. We're still working on that. The data, we start just finalizing the data. And the adoption and the likelihood of the implementation of the feedback is high when the tool is better aligned with the preferences of the engineer. However, we still observe 1 year later that the tension to keep the human around is there. It didn't go away. All the software engineering in our samples appreciate the output. They think it's valuable, it's going to improve their code, but wanting the human and their peers to be around, still around, it's still attention, it's still something highly desirable.
Cool. Thank you, Adam. So we're out of time. I just want to tell everybody on the audience, first of all, thank you for coming. I'd like to say to Neil and to Adam, thank you for presenting your really, really cool studies. Super provocative stuff. I'm glad that we got a chance to have you on here. I'd also like to say for anybody who is asking for certificates of attendance, please, we have the list of attendees we will send emails to all of you who have indicated in the webinar chat that you want a certificate of attendance. We will send you that by email, and the same email that you used to register for the webinar. But anyway, so I just want to say thank you again to Neil and to Adam for a great talk, and I hope you all across the world have a very nice rest of your day.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Sridhar. Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.